Hi, I'm James Wise, and welcome to What's Next, an interview series with founders building new technology businesses at the very forefront of what's possible. Today, we're talking to Renato Circi, the co-founder of SAVA, a business on a mission to help us better understand what's going on inside our bodies, starting with the next generation continuous glucose monitor. In this episode, we talk about Ren's journey, getting the business up and running, spinning out of university, the many challenges to scaling a medical device company, and his vision for what the future of human health and the devices we use to understand it might look like. Ren, thank you so much for joining us here at What's Next.
It's great to be here.
This interview series is really focused on people working on products that are incredibly important, we think are going to be category defining and difficult. And there's probably nothing more difficult than working on a product that people are literally going to put on their skin, right? And read and give them feedback on their health. So perhaps before we go into how you got here and the future of SAVA, let's talk a little bit about what you're building today. What are you doing at SAVA?
Sure. In a nutshell, at SAVA, we've developed a new technology that allows us to do monitoring of molecules just below your skin. You can really think about it like a connected patch that you place on your arm, you connect to your phone. It streamlines in real time all the information that's gathered, the free-flowing molecules just below your skin, and sends that information real time to a connected device. So it's really trying to streamline all these processes that typically we're doing in lab-based settings, something that is requiring a medical device, but doing it in a way that is completely effortless, that is in real time, and you can get whatever you want, whenever you want.
I mean, that's a lot of technical progress in a nutshell. And when you talk about the molecules under your skin, like what molecules, what are you looking to track, and what should we be thinking about tracking in our own health using a technology like SAVA?
Yeah, I mean, in the long term, we're big believers that if we do transition towards monitoring everything we could possibly measure, that's going to be a benefit towards transitioning in preventative healthcare monitoring, just taking better health or better care of our health. In the short term, obviously, that's a pretty big challenge to be able to accomplish. So we do take it in a very strategic fashion in the sense that there is a roadmap towards certain molecules that are easier to detect compared to others. A very obvious one is glucose monitoring, right? I think there's already some technologies like continuous glucose monitors from the Freestyle Libre, from Dexcom, that are starting to pave the way towards molecular tracking. We're just at the beginning of this whole big movement. I think glucose is one of those molecules, but really there's thousands and thousands of others that could provide a much better insight towards our health. And this could be anything from inflammatory markers, everything from hormones to metabolic markers. You can really name it. I mean, you can just look at every single thing you would typically get from a lab that you detect in blood that you could do using a technology that can continuously monitor it. It's going to take some time to get there, but I think eventually we'll get to a point where really no matter what your health goal is, you'll measure something in your body and you'll be able to optimize your health, treat a disease, and just basically just be able to provide a much better holistic understanding of people's health in general.
And I think over the last few decades, with the rise of things like Fitbits, people have got used to the idea that monitoring your activity externally can give you a good sense of how to control your health. You know how many steps you've taken, really. Maybe your Fitbit or your Apple Watch kind of gives you a bit of a nudge to say, close that ring, get to that 5,000 or 10,000 marker. With glucose, it's a really big breakthrough compared to what we had before, which was cutting yourself open and bleeding on a stick, and that's still 30-year-old technology now, maybe older. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about why tracking something like glucose, which obviously is the first molecule you're working on at the moment, is important, and who is it important for?
So glucose in itself, there's the obvious big market right now with continuous glucose monitoring, which is diabetes, right? So there's a whole category and there's a spectrum of people that could be using a technology. And we're just talking about glucose here. On one end, you have people that actually need to be able to track it to go with their day-to-day life, right? So people that have diabetes, type 1 specifically, they just cannot regulate glucose on a day-to-day basis. So they have to monitor it to be able to administer therapy, or in this case, insulin, to be able to track their glucose over time. And then there's a whole other bunch of use cases, and you can go into pre-diabetes, and you can go into weight loss, and you can go into performance, where ultimately glucose is the body's fuel. So everybody has to use glucose to produce energy. So I think no matter what the use case is, there is definitely some value in being able to track glucose, let's say in weight loss and performance and all these other markets as well. And we're definitely seeing a big movement towards that, right? So I think there's the whole glucose monitoring trend is actually trickling down way past diabetes. You've got companies like Zoe, you've got companies like Super Sapiens, for example, in the sports performance sector, and they're really tapping into the power that glucose monitoring can have, not only in chronic conditions, but in direct to consumer applications like weight loss, like performance. So I think there's definitely a massive amount of opportunity to be able to use basically measuring your body's fuel in real time to be able to optimize your way through a lot of different things. And I think we could spend hours just speaking about every single one. It's really that. It's tapping into the power of understanding what the body's fuel is and how can we track that to be able to optimize, be it a chronic condition or your day-to-day life.
Yeah. And I think over the last few years, the awareness that glucose has a much bigger role to play in our health than perhaps people assumed, and certainly people without diabetes assumed, has really come to the fore. But with that, though, there have been advances in technology. There's, as you mentioned, Abbott and companies like Dexcom. They have products on the market, right? I've tried a couple where you get a big thing and inject it into your arm and track your glucose levels for a while. How will SAVA's product differ from the products that are already on the market for people with diabetes?
Yeah, there's definitely a few key differences. I don't want to retract anything from what CGM companies did, actually. I just want to take a step back and explain for 2 seconds how truly transformational CGMs have been in the industry. These devices work really, really well. Actually, it's the first time that we were able to do continuous monitoring of molecules. And I think by far the most interesting thing, and I'm not really answering your question right now, I'll get there at some point, but it's really the biggest discovery that they've made is that they were able to measure glucose levels in a compartment in the body that up until now, we didn't know if it was even possible. Right. So I think they did an amazing job at that. And obviously, when you're tasked with that type of problem, which is let's measure glucose in a compartment that's never been done before, you take a bit of a safe route. You go a little bit deeper into the skin. You put a needle into your arm. You don't really optimize for scalability. So you start to develop this really complex, engineered product to be able to sense really, really accurately.
Because they're just looking at one molecule, right? And that's their entire focus.
Exactly, right? So at that point, the question was, we can do glucose with strips, right? And it's like, what's the next step up? And the question was, could we actually measure something that is not in blood, but in another physiological fluid? So many companies failed before. So like Google, for example, had a lens project and they tried with tears. A lot of people have tried with sweat. A lot of people have tried with saliva, for example, all these non-invasive mediums. But there's always a big challenge, which is effectively the correlation between what you get in blood and what you get in tears or in sweat typically is not that good, especially when you look at stuff like glucose. Whereas these companies, and what's really transformational about what Freestyle Libre and Dexcom have done, is that they've been able to prove once and for all that actually, if you look at interstitial fluid, which is this fluid that's just below your skin, you'll be able to measure glucose levels that reflect your blood levels really, really accurately. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty much linear, which is completely transformational from the industry. So I guess on that note, it's like, okay, these companies paved the way towards interstitial fluid monitoring. And the question that we came at it was slightly different. It wasn't, can we measure an interstitial fluid? For us was, what's the best possible way that we could do that? Which is really, really different in terms of framing the problem, right? So at that point, when you look at a CGM, there's still a lot of drawbacks in how people are actually doing it. There's a needle that goes down your arm, which is still painful. I guess if you have diabetes, you're used to putting a needle in your arm. But if you don't have diabetes, and the first thing that you do is you turn around, you look at a needle, it stares at your face, and it's a pretty scary experience.
Well, in fact, I think with type 1 diabetes, a small needle in your arm is the least of your worries, given where the technology was before.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of like what they managed to do, it's still a massive step forward. But if you ask someone that's never put a needle in their arm and all of a sudden you're telling them, okay, put this thing in your arm, I think that's a complete different type of question.
Yeah. And
anyway,
when I tried one it's actually for a Zoe test, put it in my arm, thought I was doing everything right, got in the shower and while applying body lotion, managed to knock it off, which is not an enjoyable experience if you haven't done it before.
Yeah, exactly. In the end, they are putting a filament inside your skin, and the only way to do that is by putting a needle that penetrates all the way down and leaves the sensor behind, right? So I think the user experience is something that we always saw as being definitely an improvement towards finger pricking, but not the ultimate solution or something that is so beautiful that it compares to, for example, an Oura Ring, right? So that's kind of one of the big problems that we started to see. The other one was the fact that because it was the first time we do interstitial fluid monitoring, the technologies or the engineering behind it is pretty complex, or it's very complex, which means that ultimately you end up producing a system which is very, very expensive. And I think that's a key problem right now we have in the continuous monitoring space. CGMs are extremely expensive. And right now, even if you look at it, I think the adoption of it is definitely increasing. Maybe in healthcare systems that have big budgets, people that can afford it. But when you start to look at developing countries, when you start to look at people that maybe do want to know about their glucose levels, but cannot spend, let's say, 100, 120 euros a month. And that perspective, I think bringing the cost down becomes really, really important. And the only way someone can really do that is by simplifying the way that you manufacture these systems. And the last one in the end is that in the end, health is way more complex than glucose alone, right? Glucose is kind of this one molecule. It is very important, but ultimately our health is dictated by thousands of molecules that are going up and down at the same time. So really understanding our health in a way that is really granular requires just way more than glucose alone. And right now, the architecture of what the filament-based systems right now have is just really not built for that. It's built for single molecule detection. There might be a way in which you can include a little bit more than that into one filament, but it just becomes really, really complex. So we kind of took these three problems and we said, if we had to redesign something from scratch, from the ground up, how would we actually do it? And that just requires you to start it from basically a blank canvas, right? It's how do we develop this technology, which is way less invasive, it's cost effective, it's multi-analyte. And this is basically really much what the challenge and the whole point of basically developing SAVA was about. So what are we doing? And I'm coming back to your question, which is really the technology that we built is based on these microsensors, which are barely visible with your naked eye, so really, really tiny. And they're engineered in a way so that they can go through the first layer of your skin, access interstitial fluid, but they don't hit nerve endings or capillaries. So they sit just above a place where it's, I guess, really invasive and you can feel a needle. So for example, we don't have a needle to insert our sensors into the skin, which makes it much better in terms of user experience. And then there's a whole different other technological kind of engineering aspect of it, which is how can we develop it at scale at a very low cost? And the last one is that if you're not confined to a filament, but you have a lot of tiny sensors, you can basically in the future really easily just add another little sensor that does another molecule, and you can start building a platform that does way more than glucose alone. So I guess this is really the core differences. I think on the outside, it looks like a CGM because it's a connected device, but what's powering it underneath and the technology that's powering it underneath is completely different.
Sorry, and you mentioned CGM there. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, CGMs are continuous glucose monitors. You might have seen them, people wearing them. These are these little white patches typically that people are wearing around. And yeah, they basically allow for people to do exactly what the name says. It continuously continuously monitors your glucose, and you basically get your glucose data straight to your phone.
We're discussing tracking. You're wearing an Oura ring, but you're not wearing an Apple Watch. So how do you decide what to wear? What are the devices that you've lent into?
I mean, in the end, it's about personal preference. Is how do you want to track your basic metrics? Do you want to wear something on your wrist, or do you want to wear something on your finger? I just prefer the Oura ring for a lot of different reasons. One of them is more discreet. It's a little bit smaller. I think it tracks my sleep, or at least I can sleep with it better, and I have to recharge it way less. But the thing is, in the end, these wearables pretty much all do very similar things.
The non-invasive ones.
The non-invasive ones, yeah, exactly. So they focus on peripheral metrics. So pretty much they do heart rate, they do sleep really well. There's some oxygen metrics that also you can track with, but ultimately that's pretty much it, which is great because it just already tells you something about how you sleep, how much you exercise. These kind of things are really interesting. But there's a whole new level, which is one step deeper into understanding your health, which these systems actually cannot physically go into. And a very simple one, for example, is diet, which is why continuous glucose monitoring is so interesting. It's because, ultimately health is how well you sleep, how much exercise you do, and how well you eat. And I think these wearables give you a pretty good understanding of sleep, and they give you a pretty good understanding of exercise, but pretty much nothing about what you eat, which is why glucose is so important. But then when you go one step deeper, there's all these different things that you can start tracking at the same time, because glucose as well is just a little window into how well you eat. But there's many, many, many more things that you should be able to track. And I don't think non-invasive systems would be able to get to that level of granularity.
Given that scale of competition, the money, the names involved, the resources of some of these companies, what set you off on this journey of working on SAVA and coming into a market where there's so much technical risk, but also so much competition already?
I mean, partly maybe we're a bit naive and we didn't know how truly big the challenge was. Yeah. But I guess the other part is probably the only way I can phrase it is conviction. I think luckily, Raf and I spent a lot of time looking at biosensors. And the biggest thing is we just really genuinely believe that this is the right way forward in the sense of developing something that can enable and empower individuals with their own health information. So ultimately for us, it was, although there was massive companies with unlimited budgets working on a solution like this one, we just thought that there was a way in which we could develop it that no one was really looking at in the same way we were. And we were just very convinced in the fact that that was the right way to go about it. And I think when you have that level of conviction, and even if you look at massive companies that are working on similar types of approaches, but you fundamentally don't understand why they're going it that way, the only solution for us is let's build it ourselves. And that's pretty much how we got started. But I think maybe a combination of those two things, it was, we didn't really look too much about what are other people doing. It really started from a point of conviction about how do we think the right path forward is, and just being very laser focused with that. And over time, I think a lot of people definitely question that. We had a lot of people saying Apple's doing it, Samsung's doing it. But over time, I think it got to a point where people saw enough failures in the space and started to see, or maybe believe somehow, that whatever conviction we had some grounding. And then I think over the period of time, our own confidence in it also increased. And I think ultimately got to a point where, it hasn't really changed. Our conviction towards the approach that we're using hasn't changed at all over the past 5-6 years we've been in the space.
Yeah. And maybe going even further back, so you studied at Imperial, right? You studied biology and biotechnology, if that's right.
Yeah, biomedical engineering.
Sorry about that. So did you know even then, when you started studying in this space, that you wanted to start a business, that actually you wanted to go out and, if you couldn't see a solution, build a solution, rather than, say, join one of these companies which were already working in this field?
Yeah. So Raf and I, actually, my co-founder and I, we met in the labs at Imperial, initially as friends, then as lab buddies, and then eventually as research buddies, and then co-founders eventually as well. And I think the one thing we definitely had in common was that we went into bioengineering not thinking that, it was something we just wanted to contribute in, but we actually wanted to focus on something that we could build ourselves, right? So, and I think one of the big things about it was, when you look at a lot of the academic industries, and when you look at a lot of especially in the engineering spaces, the way that it works is you've got all these research groups working on really long-term horizon projects that you contribute for a couple of years on, and then someone else will take over, and maybe they'll work, maybe they won't. But every single thing that we were drawn to was, what are the technologies that we think could actually make it outside of the lab, and what chance of success do they have, and making it into a tangible product. So every single thing that we ever worked on was on that, right? So we basically, a lot of it for us was, we fundamentally always had the idea that if we are going to work on something, do we see the potential for this to actually make it to the hands of the everyday consumer? Which is, I think, very, very different from trying to work on something that's never been done before, that could take forever, and you're just doing it for the intellectual curiosity of it. For us, there was one element that had to match up, which was, can I actually make it to the market? So I guess for us, this is something that we always had inside, and we had idea booklets, and we had all sorts of different research groups that we're looking into, that we were like, which one do we actually believe that could spin out into something that is exciting? So we actually spent a lot of time really thinking about this from pretty much the moment we joined a university.
But I think it's an amazing example of how, like, having the right prism or mental model, whatever you want to call it, when you go into a problem space, just changes the likely outcome, right? You were inevitably thinking that way. You were inevitably probably going to start a company, right? Whereas many people would have gone into that kind of lab setting because their end goal was to get a PhD, or their end goal was to become a professor, or they wanted to work on this problem for 20 years, and they didn't care whether it was commercialized or not. Did you feel like Imperial's a phenomenal university, right? And especially when it comes to things like bioengineering and chemistry. Did you feel like the academic environment you were in was conducive to supporting that kind of exploration of real commercial ideas, or was it a hindrance?
I've got mixed feelings about this. I think ultimately it depends on where you end up in the university. So certain research groups are very much about intellectual curiosity. Push the boundaries of science. Discovery is the ultimate goal. And if that's what you're motivated by, I think that's definitely the path, and you can find something like this. There's other research groups where maybe they're a little bit more practical, and they actually start to put in your mind that what is, I guess, good engineering principles, which ultimately is a product that works in any, in basically in the market, right? Getting something to the market. From our perspective, definitely there was that calling on our side, but I do believe that there's something about Imperial, which maybe the ecosystem was, I think there was definitely a group within Imperial that were a lot of engineers just like us that did have the same mentality that we had, And somehow we managed to find ourselves within that little community, which when we joined was very, very small. So there was maybe a bunch of little startups or research groups or PhDs that all started companies in a very similar stage. And to this day, they all managed somehow to start a company out of them. So I think if you manage to find your way through this whole group in academia that gets that is excited about building a product that they ultimately want to hand to the end consumer or that can have an impact in the real world, we definitely managed to find something like that at Imperial. But the majority of stuff, I think, isn't like that. Or at least when we were there, it was a small group of, there's a handful of people that kind of had that, or there was like 10 people that had that. And we seemed like we were a bunch of crazy people because we were in the undergrounds in a lab that no one even knew how to get there. There was the entrepreneurial groups, which was literally, I think, the second floor underneath the reception of the main entrance, which no one even knew existed. So yeah, it definitely felt like initially there wasn't a lot of us. I think nowadays it's probably changed, but it definitely was a bit of that.
And just to play devil's advocate, was it really the case that there were entrepreneurial groups that you got sucked into, or was it the case that you had to build that yourself?
I would say on a high level, university did not have entrepreneurship, at least when we were part of it, as the key messaging, how really inspirational entrepreneurship can be in a space where you're pushing the boundaries of science. Because the first thing, I just remember this really, really well, is you go to a science or a career fair at Imperial College, the first thing that you see, which is really, really weird, is a consulting stand and you see a finance stand. And then you see all these posters about the research that people are doing. And right at the back, you've got a couple of companies that have started an amazing business out of the research that we were doing, which for us was, we literally had to go look for it purposely to find some people that wanted to do the same things that we wanted to do. But the first thing that you're hit with is finance, it's consulting, it's research groups, some engineering companies. And then at the end, there was entrepreneurship. Things might have changed over the years, and definitely I can see way more entrepreneurial spirit at Imperial, but at least when we were part of the university experience that we went through, was that unless you're purposely looking for it, and unless you take your own initiative and you take things in your own hands, actually there's no direct, really simple route to be able to embark on an entrepreneurial journey if you're doing research at a university.
Yeah. So studies of this, and obviously I wrote a book on this thesis, but studies that suggest that only 6% of founders of businesses, whether they are software businesses or hard tech businesses, feel that their university played a integral role in them becoming an entrepreneur. But the number one reason why they became entrepreneurs was actually role models and peers. And so it's kind of, the university platform has its advantages and disadvantages. And what it seems to be most important is your peer group. But of course, your and Raf's initial desire to be entrepreneurs probably meant you ended up surrounding yourselves with entrepreneurial people anyway, right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Part of it's the peers you're around suck you in, but also a part of it's you're pushing that group forward, which really makes a difference. So you went to Imperial, you met your co-founder, you worked together knowing that you wanted to work on a problem that had real world impact, real commercial viability, because that's probably one of the best ways to get real world impact. Where did you go from there? Once you've had the idea, you've studied it, you've got your initial concept, how do you get the funding to take that first step in starting a business?
It wasn't easy.
No.
Ultimately, we as much as possible got our idea and then tried to get people excited about it. And the way that our first ever investment round was actually from 2 angel investors that we had met through networks that ultimately got really excited about what we wanted to build. And their investment, I like to believe, was most definitely about the fact that they believed in what we wanted to build. But the second one was the enthusiasm and maybe the stubbornness that we had towards trying to get it to work.
Do they have technical backgrounds out of interest?
Or
in your space?
Not in our space.
Like in medical devices or bioengineering or
not in our space. I think what they were most aligned to was the vision that we had and how we saw the future of health monitoring, for sure. But in terms of technical background, no, they didn't have that much of a technical background. And then after that, basically, we were part of an accelerator, which is basically a life science accelerator. So we did get eventually some investors which are very, very technically focused. But I think the first ever check that we did get was, effectively someone that was aligned with the vision of what we wanted to build. But it wasn't easy. We just had to speak with so many people, and we were first-time founders, so it was very, very challenging. And you can imagine it's like two grads that just span out a company, which on paper have no experience in starting a company, trying to convince someone to build something this complex. It's not an easy thing. But I think ultimately it gets back to the conviction element, which is like we were just so convinced that we wanted to do it, that we managed to basically convince someone that was aligned with what we wanted to build to believe in us and write us a first check. And I think from there, it's like your confidence just keeps on building up.
Yeah. But what's amazing about, obviously I've been on the other side of the table with both of you pitching me, and the amount of energy you bring to every conversation and every debate and every discussion is just incredible. And actually, I've never had a meeting with both of you where I've left the room with less energy. It's almost always more energy. But I guess one of the perspectives I've had on that is, but you must have been through so many no's and so many rejections in your fundraising process, and yet taken that level of energy to every meeting. Which, do you think that's just a prerequisite to be successful when fundraising is such a difficult area?
Yeah. In a nutshell, I would say so.
Yeah.
I think if you're not somehow motivated and you're not addicted to failures and getting rejected, it's not a good company to start for sure. Because I think even if you look at the type of investors that we can target or we can actually speak with, there's very, very few investors that ultimately would be a good fit for us. And initially when you get started, you still speak with all the investors and you kind of start to build this map of all the investors you want to speak with. And it's very easy to pick out a problem for the type of thing that we're doing. It's either technologically very complex, it's way too capital intensive. The conventional metrics that people use, like revenue, are not really applicable in our case.
Well, not yet.
Oh, not yet, right? So there's basically like this, when you start to look at all the reasons why people might say no, you end up with this really, really small cohort of people that ultimately would potentially say yes. And the pursuit of finding those people is just a string of rejections. And you only learn who the right type of investor is by just constantly going to meetings and just seeing why people are saying no. And then you just continue basically navigating that space until you find someone that says yes. But yeah, ultimately, I think by far, whenever we go into an investor meeting, we definitely have to have high energy, but some of the lows we hit are really low, right? I think the additional thing is that I do believe that failures in a space where it's like deep tech, I think hit much harder than a lot of other businesses. And maybe I'm biased because that's the kind of companies we're building, but sometimes it's really, really difficult to keep on because the failures in our case, they're not, it's very rare that you have a company where a lot of the decisions you make could result in a delay, which is not a month or even a couple of weeks, but it's like potentially 6 months of delays. And I think for an entrepreneur that ultimately wants to grow their company fast and looks at all these role models and wants to build a big company, knowing that every decision you might make or every mistake you might make could result in a delay, which is a 6-month delay, it's a heavy blow. Yeah. And this trickles down. Yeah, I think. Maybe a spot of why it's so different.
And I think it's, as an investor as well, because obviously I sit on the boards of pure software businesses, of energy businesses, financial services businesses, and health and deep tech businesses. As an investor, you see, and the founders in deep tech businesses dealing with a much lower cadence of feedback. By which I mean, if you're dealing in a software business which is going mass consumer, every day you can look at the download numbers, you can look at the activity numbers, you can look at the revenue numbers and unit economics, and they may be going in a good direction or a bad direction, but you're getting that daily feedback. Whereas what you're working on, there's so many points of inflection where, if this goes well, wow, the entire structure of the business, but also structure of the market has changed. If it goes badly, you're right, we're set back by months or years in extreme cases. And so I can see how that level of low cadence of feedback can be tough. And you both bring such incredible energy and enthusiasm still to the table, which I think is just absolutely remarkable. And probably you're right, a prerequisite to people being successful in building these kind of businesses. Just to go back just one bit to your fundraising experience. Did you feel that you had to change your pitch for different types of investors? Because what you're working on, some life science investors will look at it and be like, oh, this is interesting. You're measuring molecules. I get that. I work in molecules. And some software investors may say, oh, this is interesting. You're working in data, right? I get data. I like tracking data and understanding how people change because of that data. So I get it. But at the same time, both of them don't necessarily understand each other's world, right? So there's a whole part of SAVA's business, which until I did the research and listened to you guys, I didn't know the science behind tracking glucose molecules. So did you have to really adapt your pitch to every single person you met?
We tried, definitely. The big thing is definitely we try to go with the approach where we're saying, okay, this is the type of investor we're meeting. This is how we have to change our deck. This is how we have to, the messaging has to be different. It has to be about data. It has to be about the chemistry. It has to be about what did we think got them excited. But ultimately, I think there was one thing that we ended up doing a lot of, which was a big, big mistake looking backwards, which was we were trying to adapt our pitch based on what we thought people wanted to hear instead of pitching what we thought was right. And at a certain point, something clicked on saying that if ultimately an investor is not gonna get excited about, and if the message that we're trying to convey, which is the most truthful to what we want to build, doesn't resonate with the investor we're speaking with, they're probably not the right investor for us anyway. I think the moment that we started to phrase it like this, it became much, much easier for us to be able to have conversations, because we just pitched what we thought was right. And if an investor came that actually saw the future or how we're going about it in the same way, when we met that type of investor, everything clicked much, much faster. And it was such an easy pitch. It was such an easy conversation. Whereas ultimately, if you try to really morph what you're building based on what you think people are going to hear, at some point, it's really evident that you're pitching something that is not really core to what you are, what the DNA of the company is. So in my experiences, pitch what you think is right. And then the investors that resonate with that messaging will actually come to you. And I think that's a much better position to be in than really trying to formulate a pitch which you think will resonate with whoever you're speaking with.
I think when we first began to speak, and it was a long process, but when we first began to speak, because we had multiple touch points over the years, it was that 10-year view which I was most excited by. But then on your board, you've also got some great life science investors as well, some storied life science investors who have a much shorter, share the long-term impact, but also have a much deeper understanding of the short-term milestones you're going to have to hit in order to enable that vision, right? I think there's lots of unlocks as we go, whether it's regulatory or it's scientific to build, which we share as a company, but it does get reflected in board discussions. I feel that there's people who come at this challenge from different backgrounds, which is good. Hopefully you find that breadth of advice helpful and not a hindrance.
Yeah, ultimately you need both, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a category of investor just gets really excited by the massive vision, and I think that's the ultimate goal, so they can really be patient and just work towards that massive vision. But then there's other types of investors, life science investors typically, which are really driven by some key short-term milestones like regulatory approvals, like performance metrics of the product. But ultimately, we've got to be able to speak both languages and reconcile whatever the short-term goals we're building towards the massive big vision that we have. And I think having investors that lean more towards one side in certain discussions and others that lean towards more short-term milestones, maybe on regulatory milestones, is definitely a benefit, because ultimately both things have to work out.
Yeah. And so to go back to the story a little bit, you found each other.
Yeah.
You were part of this sort of slightly more entrepreneurial group at Imperial. You managed to go from there, raise a bit of funding, angels, now institutional funding with backers like Balderson. If you look at the challenges you faced on the journey over the last couple of years, what have been the things which actually those are the challenges you expected them to be, and you've managed to navigate them? And what have been the perhaps more surprising challenges in building the business that if you were to start out again, or if you're advising another person going into building a hard tech company, you'd want them to be aware of? Like, has anything come at you completely from left field and thought, oh God, that's a lot harder than we thought it was going to be?
Definitely it's much harder than we initially thought it was going to be. This is why one of the things that I think probably played in our benefit was us being a little bit naive as co-founders and believing that, okay, we can build this and we can do it really fast, because then we just went full on into the journey. But I think one big takeaway is probably the way we, over the years, started to set expectations between, and really not shying away from the fact that what we're building is extremely complex, right? I think initially when we got started, that was something we're hiding away, because we thought, okay, investors are just going to be very, very scared by the fact that we're building a very technologically challenging product. And over the years, I think we started to really realize that that's actually where the value of the company really is. The fact that we're being upfront with the fact that we're building something that no one else has been able to do before actually demonstrates that it is worthwhile being able to, put a lot of effort in it. And I think the moment in which you start becoming a little bit more upfront that there is inevitably some really big technological challenges that we're striving towards or we're trying to solve, the conversations become much easier. The expectations that you can set up are way more realistic. And I think the whole journey becomes way more productive. And I think it's really easy to fall into the trap where you're trying to hide away the fact that it's a very technological problem, because ultimately that truth will come out in one way or another. So the one thing I would say, if someone's working on a very difficult challenge, I think it sounds really counterintuitive, but exposing those challenges and being very clear with what those are and offsetting it towards what the ultimate opportunity is, what the ultimate impact you can have is probably the right way of framing a company like this one. Although it's very tempting as a founder to just hide away all your weaknesses and pitching only the positive stuff. I think ultimately in the long term, it pays off to actually be very transparent to where the real challenge of what you're building is.
Yeah. And I think that's not just true when talking to investors, but also potential employees, right? And I think actually some of the businesses I've worked with, which have been most transparent about the timelines that the business is working on in order to get that first regulatory approval, get that first demo out there, get the first product, and get that first commercialization going. If you deceive employees and give them like very short timelines, we're going to beat everyone else, don't worry about it, we're going to be shipping in a year, I think you get a lot of disgruntled people. Whereas if you have that shared expectation that, look, this is going to take patience, there's going to be a lot of failure, you're going to have to be very resilient in this company from day one, then when those inevitable challenges and roadblocks hit, they'll take it in their stride, or at least hope they take it in their stride.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the most remarkable things you've built is that team around you.
Yeah. I mean, we've been so lucky with our team, just really exceptional teams. Some of the people that have been here for so long. And in the end, as well, I think the one thing that they share with us is, one, obviously the passion for what they're building, but two, is the resilience element. We've got some of the key members that have been here right from the beginning, pretty much, of the company, that have had the thick skin to basically just go from failure to failure and continue building and pouring their souls into their product, which I think is just a prerequisite of building something like this. I do want to say that ultimately, it's good to be transparent with the challenges that we have, but I think it's also very important to be very aggressive at timelines. Obviously, there's a good balance between the two, but I think, ultimately it's like you've got to strive for very, very aggressive timelines, but set the expectations that failure can happen, and it's something that is normal as part of the journey. And there is a balance for sure. I think ultimately you can't say that something's going to take forever, because then no one's going to get excited about it. So there must be some timeline element here somewhere.
But if we do get that crystal ball out a little bit and look into the future of both what you're building at SAVA and what personal healthcare may look like in sort of 5 or 10 years' time, I guess the first question is, when do you hope that people will be able to access SAVA's products and start getting mass access, not just people in clinical trials, mass access to SAVA's products? And in 5 years' time, what do you think SAVA's product's going to be doing?
I mean, the ultimate aim is to be able to do way more than glucose alone, and the applications that we do want to unlock are way more than glucose and diabetes. I think you got to start somewhere. So I think the first product we'll be launching will be with glucose, and I think diabetes is one of the big markets that we can have a big impact in, and it's an obvious next step. But ultimately, we don't see SAVA as being a diabetes company at all. I think a lot of things are happening right now. Like you said, there's a lot of market trends that are starting to basically paint a picture of something that, even just with glucose, we can go into a lot of different markets and a lot of different applications. And the whole idea, I think, for SAVA is, the way that we see it is, we can build, and we're actually right at the inflection point, I think, of this massive new industry of healthcare monitoring, which will span a lot of different applications. And the one biggest bottleneck that we see is, we need that data in the first place. Like, without being able to unlock continuous monitoring data sets, this whole movement of new applications, new healthcare services is just not going to happen in the same way that everyone expects, just because you do need to have a higher resolution, high frequency data points that people can access at any moment in time to be able to access, to basically give rise to the whole new services in health that we can't even imagine right now. So the one thing I know is that definitely the continuous monitoring space will not be about glucose and diabetes alone. There's going to be multiple services in the world of health monitoring. What exactly those will be, I don't know. We don't have a crystal ball, but I think my bet is that there's going to be a lot of different services, a lot of different companies working on molecular tracking that unlock use cases in health that we can't even imagine. And it could be, like I said before, maybe it's weight loss performance and some well-being applications, but it could be even other chronic conditions that we didn't know about. It could also be preventing all sorts of different illnesses. I think ultimately time will tell, but I think maybe an analogy would be, once some of these platform technologies come about, it's like your phone. It's like once you open up third-party developers to have an app in your phone, no one would have ever imagined that we had, social media platforms, that we're going to reinvent banking, that we're going to do all these different things. No one was really able to predict that fully, but there was, I think, a common understanding that if you actually do give something like a smartphone in the hands of the everyday individual, there's just going to be countless different services that can be built on top of that. And I think the same thing will happen with health. I don't know exactly when, I don't know to what degree, how many different services, but the same thing will happen. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. And I think one of the closest comparables I have in my mind is what happened in genomics over the last 30 years, right? We all know that genomic data is probably one of the richest data sets that we need in understanding health. It wasn't until Illumina and Thermo Fisher and the other big machines that could read this genomic data came along, and then they were spitting out data which other platforms used and helped identify everything from early stage cancer detections and rare diseases to more other chronic conditions. And then now, finally, a decade on, that data is being used to develop therapeutics as well, to actually develop cures. And I hope, or right now, we can only imagine what will be possible when a technology like SAVA unlocks a similar level of data for the molecules going around your body. And obviously, we have a very clear plan about what we want to achieve in the next 5 years. But I hope your approach and the data that you unlock ultimately inspires other entrepreneurs like yourselves to go and build stuff on top of that data and find whether it's interventions for weight loss or it's interventions for diseases we can't even imagine could be cured or supported through the data that we unlock. Either way, I think that opportunity set is just opening up now. And so look, it's incredibly exciting working with you. And as I said at the beginning, every meeting I have with you both, I leave with more energy than I had at the beginning, which is very good news for anyone working in CGM in particular. And that's also true